Hi everyone! Today I will be talking about lesson planning, whether for in-person or remote teaching. As a disclaimer, what I'm sharing here might sound a little unorthodox from what you are used to hearing, but it's my practical take from everything I've learned in conferences, PDs, but more importantly from what I've learned from my own students. So here is how I plan my lessons. The first thing, of course, is to figure out the what, the concept or skill I want my students to learn. This is usually outlined by the state course standards. However, course standards are usually very vague and broad, so I always have to break it down into subsets of skills or concepts per lesson for my students to eventually master that standard. In the lesson, this is usually referred to as the learning or content objective. Some call it can-do statements, I will statements, or essential questions. What is key here is to make sure that I make it visible to my students, that I address it, and most importantly, I sell it to my students. Because understanding the why of a learning objective will get my students more engaged in the lesson as if they don't know it. Even when students seem apathetic, it is a lot easier to engage them if we are able to show the relevance in their learning. Then I figured out the how. What learning tasks or research-based strategies, tools, and resources I can use to help my students learn the content objective. Many refer to these as language objectives, which is confusing for many teachers because of the way it is often explained. Most of the literature and PD sessions I've attended about this topic focus more on the writing or creation of these language objectives than in the actual practicality of language objectives, making them seem more of a burden than an asset. They are usually introduced as something new, something that needs to be added to help ELLs, when in reality it is a universal teaching practice important for all learners and simpler and more intuitive than it looks. Because when you think about it, the main goal of using language objectives really is the core of teaching, to be cognizant of the use of language in the lesson and supporting that language adequately. Not just in the ELA or ESL classroom, but more so in the content classroom. Not just for our ELL students, but for all of our students, because language is a vehicle for learning. Language is embedded in learning. Therefore, it has to be explicitly addressed in the lesson. I find it not only complicated, but impractical to focus so much on crafting these formulaic language objectives that don't even consider all of the other language functions required to achieve that very same language objective. What difference in the effectiveness of your lesson will make having this particular language objective here? All the time you spend crafting this and it still isn't scaffolded or broken down enough. There are a lot of other language skills we need to support for students to even reach this language objective. That's why I prefer to start by outlining the specific learning tasks or activities my students will need to do in order to achieve the content objective, then identify the language demands in each one of those learning tasks, and lastly, create adequate supports for my students to achieve the overall learning goal. I start by writing the content objective in a student-friendly format. Then I think of the activities my students will need to do to achieve the content objective. I list them in sequence while considering the following: that I include a starter activity for students to settle as they come into the classroom, that learning tasks are linked to the content objective, that learning tasks represent more than one language domain, listening, reading, speaking, writing, that learning tasks include verbs from Bloom's and Costa's frameworks, that learning tasks are student-centered, engaging, and allow student interaction, that the sequencing, pacing, and timing of learning tasks are adequate, that I plan an extension or alternate learning tasks for students at a more advanced level or those at a lower level, that I include a type of formative assessment, and that I have included an opportunity for students to practice or extend their learning homework. Then I go through each learning task and I quickly ask myself these questions. What language functions and structures does this particular learning task require? I underline the words that indicate the language domain and function, and then I think about the language structure it requires. The other question I ask myself is, what language supports do my students need in order to successfully complete each learning task? For example, at the vocabulary level, word banks, word lists, translations, explicit vocabulary teaching. At the sentence level, sentence frames, a grammar structure snapshot or mini lesson, and then at the discourse level, things like outlines, closed paragraphs, mentor texts, level texts, anything that will help my students carry on the learning task successfully. And lastly, I ask myself, what learning scaffolds can I provide to guide my students in completing each learning task successfully? It can be a tool or a resource like manipulatives, visuals, graphic organizers, assistive technology, or it could be a process scaffold already embedded in an activity or learning task, like a metacognitive strategy, a think pair share, checking for understanding, etc. So, for example, let's say this is one of the learning tasks from a science lesson. We will write a paragraph that explains the steps we followed in the lab experiment. The language domain here is writing. The language function is explaining a process. The language structure needed is words that show sequence of events or adverbs in past tense verbs. And the language support I should provide my students is word bank of adverbs of sequence and past tense verbs. As a scaffold for learning, I can provide my students with a paragraph outline with sentence frames. And that's it. It's a very minimal but significant mindset shift in lesson planning. It's about being more cognizant and purposeful of every learning activity in the lesson and the language supports that will allow all of your students, despite their language proficiency levels, access learning successfully. It's what I like to call common sense teaching. Then in class, I display all of these learning tasks in the form of an agenda. It is very helpful not only to avoid the never-ending question of what are we doing today, but also to keep me on track of what we're doing, the pace, and the sequence. If you would like a copy of any of the resources mentioned in this video today, you can just go to my website. The link is in my bio, and click on the free resources tab to download a free PDF copy. I hope you found this helpful. Thank you for watching, and ciao!